Welcome to Human School. I'm your host, Dr. Patil Armenian. After 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, and 2 years of fellowship, I thought I was done. I did my time, got my degrees, and now I was just gonna live life. Well, think again. Some of my greatest schooling has come after my formal education was complete, and it keeps on coming. Join me at Human School, where we can learn together. I'm an emergency physician and medical toxicologist working at a large teaching hospital in California. I'm also a mom, wife, sister, daughter, and friend. Whether you work in healthcare or not, you too lead a busy life. Together, let's work on how we can thrive in all of our real-world roles. Please listen, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Follow me on Instagram at Human School Podcast, and feel free to let me know what topics or guests you want to hear about. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review it. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Human School. Today on with us is a very special guest, Dr. Paul Daley. Hi, Paul.
Hi there, Patil. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for coming on. Now, we've known each other for a long time now, but why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Okay, well, so I'm a California product. I was, born out here and educated at elementary schools in LA, and then the family moved up to Davis. So I went through junior high, high school, bachelor's, master's degree, all in Davis. And that's kind of where I got bitten by the psychedelics bug, if you will, both from personal experience and also in 1972, I was just starting out what became an offering from the environmental toxicology division, but what at that time was an individual major that I cooked up with one of the faculty members there. In part of that, I was made aware that there was a group in another department, soils and plant nutrition, who had been doing work on tryptamines in range grass, Phalaris tuberosa, and related species. And so I met those folks and talked them into taking me on as an intern. And that's where I got my chops started with doing analytical chemistry. So worked with a woman who had a lovely collection of scientific literature on psychedelics. And all this was kind of a surprise to me. I knew that there were scientists who worked on this stuff, but I didn't really have any access. And of course, back then, you had to really know how to use the card catalogs and browse the stacks in the library because there was no internet. That was a dream. And anyway, so the woman that ran this plant nutrition lab had apparently a pretty well-developed interest in the chemistry of psychedelics. Never would have thought to consume them herself. But nonetheless, she had a copy of that 1969 volume, The Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. She had a stack of photocopies of papers, and then there was this one by a character named Alexander Shulgin that I read. It was the 1969 paper in Nature. Let's see. The structure-activity relationships of the one-ring psychotomimetics. So that paper kind of summarized the previous 10 years of Sasha's exploration into psychedelic phenethylamines and substituted amphetamines. Of course, at that point, as an undergraduate, let's see, had I had organic chem? I don't even think I'd had organic chem yet. That went flying right over my head, but I could tell that there was something really cool going on there. So anyway, finished that bachelor's, decided that I needed more biological background. So I got my master's and PhD in insects, which oddly enough seems to be almost a prerequisite to being a psychedelics chemist, in that both Shulgin and Raphael Mechoulam, who discovered the structure of delta-9 THC, both got their chemistry starts doing insecticide chemistry. So we're all kind of cycling around each other.
That is a very interesting intersection right there, especially when you said, I got bit by the psychedelics bug. It's like all of you are in bugs, insects.
Yes. Well, so I, was kind of thinking, well, first off, in 72, I would have loved to have continued work in the psychedelics, I was just starting to get access to some advanced, well, what at that time was advanced instrumentation, gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy. But it was also right around the time that Mr. Nixon decided that he would have a war on drugs. So basically, at least from the standpoint of someone at an agriculture school, there wasn't really any avenue for a young person to really follow that line of work. So my sort of second choice was environmental protection, which led me into the entomology. At that time, the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was still pretty fresh, and the Earth Day had just happened for the first time. So there was a lot of interest in protecting the environment from the unfortunate bad effects of industrialized, chemically oriented agriculture. So I kind of pursued that and kept going in that. Did masters in entomology and PhD in entomology, that the latter at UC Berkeley. And right as I moved to Berkeley in June of '77, I picked up a copy of the well-known, sort of notorious underground newspaper, the Berkeley Barb, and there was this ad for the Second International Conference on Hallucinogenic Mushrooms. Well, I had no idea that there was such a thing as conferences about psychedelic mushrooms. Of course,
Yeah.
I've been growing those enthusiastically since '75, when the McKenna brothers were kind enough to bring some cultures back from South America that spread rapidly. I mean, really rapidly. I can't imagine anything that grew quicker except for perhaps artificial intelligence. Anyway, so at first I saw this ad and I thought, I don't know if I could do that. I'm down here trying to take a button down course and, inveigle myself into hardline agriculture and make some change. And so I thought, I can't do that. So a couple of weeks later, I saw the same ad again. I read it a little more carefully, and Albert Hoffman was going to speak, Richard Evans Schultes was going to speak, Gordon Wasson, and I thought, oh shit, I can't not be there. So bought my ticket, drove up to Port Townsend, Washington, and the walked into the first sort of wine and cheese social, and the first three people I met were first Andrew Weil. I had just probably pretty recently read The Natural Mind, which I still recommend to people. And, I said, oh, enjoyed your book thoroughly. I didn't really know his history, to be frank. Anyway, so that went on for a bit. And I turned to the next person. Well, that was Sasha. And, so he said, okay, and why are you here? And so I kind of gave him my rundown of having worked with tryptamine chemistry and, kind of in a way that I eventually learned was sort of very typical. He's like, oh, well, maybe you could tell me about this. And he just pried my brain open for a little while. And then turned to the third person who introduced himself as Bob Sager. And I didn't know then that he and Shulgin had been friends for 10 years plus at that point. But he said, oh, you're interested in analytical chemistry. You should come visit my lab. I run the Drug Enforcement Administration Western Regional Laboratory in San Francisco. So I thought kind of gulp. Either I'm really in trouble now or I've arrived somehow. So, so in any event, when I let Sasha know that I was studying at Berkeley, he said, "Oh, you're practically in my backyard. Come to visit." So around November, a month later, in '77, I came out to the farm here for the first time. At that point, this is before he had met Ann, who became the love of his life and working partner and confidant and spiritual leader and all that good stuff. And his son Ted was not around. He was living elsewhere at the time. So it was just Sasha and myself, and he walked me out to the lab. And first thing he did was to show me his DEA license. And, oh, I got a Schedule one license. I can handle any controlled substance. Make anything we want here. And then of course he started to bring down boxes of his little tubes of reference compounds, and with kind of delight, saying, "Oh, this is some of the things I've been working on for the last little bit," and hundreds of compounds, and I
Mhm.
really
Yeah,
never.
it's like boxes and boxes.
That's right. That's right. And I had never really gotten far enough in organic chemistry to really appreciate that that's not so unusual. If you're, getting into a particular compound area, of course, you make as many compounds as you can and try to evaluate their properties. And, but in any event, since I knew that these were all potentially psychedelics, it was very impressive. So,
Of course.
yeah. So anyway, so that was in 77. I kind of went back to work, getting my degree together at Berkeley. In 78, I had another visit to the farm, but it was under very different circumstances. The Bay Area was kind of rocked during the third week of November of 78. I think sometime a little bit prior to that, I had been at the third of those psychedelic mushroom conferences, which was in San Francisco this time. I heard Sasha speak at that one. He hadn't spoken at the previous one. A little later, third week in November, the Bay Area was kind of rocked by the news out of Guyana that the People's Temple had kind of gone bluey, and there'd been shootings and a mass suicide, and anyway, so that news started to break over a weekend. It turns out that the gentleman who was the chairman of our research group that I was working with at Berkeley, a very wonderful, charismatic entomologist by the name of Robert Vandenbosch, arch defender of organic agriculture and practitioner of classical biological control, so using natural means, insects eating insects to control pest species. And he's really the person who inspired me to come into that field and to come to Berkeley. Well, anyway, he was out running in the Berkeley Hills, dropped down dead on the Sunday. So we got that news on the Monday, and then during the week, of course, more and more news came out of Guyana, and that was putting everybody on edge. And then, of course, that Friday was the Harvey Milk George Moscone murders. So it was a very dark time. And in my little research group there at Berkeley, there was a sort of an active conversation about, could Van den Bosch have met with foul play? He had just published a book, The Pesticide Conspiracy, that was a full body slam on the chemical industry's penetration into agriculture and really destruction of agricultural habitats through chemicals. And that had come out just, I think, in January of 78. And Van den Bosch had already probably developed a lot of enemies and in very powerful places, testifying against unethical practices in pesticide sales and promotion, testifying in front of Senate committees, court cases. So there was this, question in our minds, could he have met with foul play? So I knew that Shulgin taught forensic toxicology, so I phoned him up and said, I don't know if you'll remember me, but here's the situation. So he said, well, okay, so first off, unless this gentleman was very elderly or under the direct care of a physician at the time of death, there would be an autopsy in California. And the autopsy is a public record. So my advice would be, if you really want to pursue this, go down to the county where he passed, get a hold of the autopsy report, bring it out, and we'll go through it and see if there's anything to pursue. So the second time I had an afternoon with Sasha Shulgin was going through that autopsy report. And we did that sitting at the dining room table here at the house at the farm. So it turns out, there was I guess what at that time would have been called silent heart disease, atherosclerosis, that was not picked up. Part of the thing that made us kind of suspicious was that Van had just had a full stress test physical, like 2 weeks before his heart attack, and passed with flying colors. No hint of anything amiss. Today, of course, he would have been a bypass patient or stent patient,
Yeah.
whatever. But that was the state of the technology. So anyway, so when we found that, it was like, well, okay, there's not really much likelihood that there was foul play. And of course, then Sasha kind of turned the conversation. Well, okay, you're a toxicologist. If you wanted to kill someone chemically and leave no trace, how would you do it? So, conversation wound around to, succinylcholine and, some other nasty materials that might be considered. And, it was with kind of a twinkle in his eye, but compassionate, about my grief and yet kind of leading me, down forest path with breadcrumbs. So anyway, so that's how I met him and got to know him a bit. I finished the doctorate at Berkeley in '81 and moved to Quebec City, Canada, to do more insect field work. Did that for 2.5 years. Turned my creaky Spanish into even creakier French. Came back and got hired on at a large Department of Energy National Laboratory, the Livermore Laboratory, where there had been environmental programs really since the dawn of the nuclear age. The Department of Energy, well, a lot of people, including the Secretary of the Department of Energy that we had under Trump's first administration, who thought that it was an organization that was going to focus on petroleum fuels. Anyway, no, I'm afraid the DOE was basically
Yeah,
founded.
that's not what it is.
Yeah, it's founded on the heels of the Atomic Energy Commission and basically to design the nuclear war chest of the United States. Anyway, they realized kind of early on back in the 50s that there were dramatic impacts of nuclear warfare on environment and on human health. And so there had always been biological research divisions and environmental science divisions. And so I got hired into the latter, working on vegetation response to atmospheric carbon dioxide increase. Worked on that for a couple of years, finished up the project, by which time I had a wife and two babies. And so I ended up kind of having to scramble to keep the mortgage paid and ended up being hired as a staff scientist into their environmental restoration division. So I worked on cleaning groundwater contamination and soil contamination of chlorinated solvents and fuels and that kind of lovely thing for 25 years. But always my thoughts kept drifting back towards psychedelics, even though the DOE was not the place where you could discuss such things or even think about them. Sometime in the late 90s, I started visiting Sasha again at intervals, not to try to inveigle myself into his, scientific operation, but just to kind of, you know, re up the friendship and watch the scene around here. And make a long story short, I met my present wife in 2004. Sasha performed the wedding ceremony for the two of us here in 2007. And at the ensuing party, I happened onto a conversation that Ann, his wife, was having with a close friend, Tanya Manning, about a benefactor who had stepped forward and offered to fund a half-time position for a chemist to work with Sasha. So it turned out that the Livermore lab was going through not quite as aggravated government shutdown as we've been experiencing in the last few months, but they were running into money problems. And so I approached my management, said, can I drop back to half time? They were happy for me to do that. It helped them out. So for the last 7 years of Sasha's life, I was here from 25 to 40 hours a week while I was also still prosecuting a halftime position out there at Livermore, and just became a little bit kind of adopted into the Shulgin family operation. So
Yeah, you're definitely part of the family.
yeah. So I've been thinking about the remarks for the upcoming celebration of Sasha's 100th birthday. One of the things that was asked is, can you remember, something striking about, something that happened between, you generically and the Shulgins. I was thinking the first time that I walked into the place back in '77, that first visit, and Sasha standing right outside the window where I am right now, looks up to me as I'm getting out of the car and says, "Hello, friend." I'm thinking, I met you once, friend. Well, okay. And, it turned out. But then there was another event, and I don't even remember the context, but Anne turned to me at some point after I'd already been, I think, working here and said, "Oh, no, don't worry about that. You're part of family now." And, those two really kind of hit me. I was an only kid, left my family basically at kind of age 17 to go to university, and I think I've always been looking for siblings and family situations, and even professionally, I've always gravitated towards groups that had a family kind of atmosphere. And at Livermore, that was hard to find. The group that I worked with last out there was as close to that kind of feeling, sort of a graduate research group kind of atmosphere as I had experienced, in the previous 25 odd years. So I really appreciated kind of wrapping up my experience out there with them. That was the Center for Accelerator Mass Spectrometry, folks who work with barn-sized instruments to measure rare isotopes like carbon 14 and radionuclides and that kind of thing. Anyway, you didn't want to hear all that.
I do want to hear all of it. I love it. Well, I just also love that you had this very normal sounding job too for forever, right? For a really long time. That was also very interesting and fascinating. But then you still had this thought of this other topic that you were really interested in. And then when you got the chance to work in that, you jumped on it.
Yeah, and it's a challenging area, as I'm sure you're aware. It's the those years that I spent working with Sasha, we had, the same kind of non-existent budget that he had dealt with for decades. And I kind of had training in how to do that. I mean, agricultural scientists are, way down at the bottom of the financial underpinnings of science, way after, the bomb guys and the medical guys and sort of the mainline subdisciplines, in scientific endeavors get funded. The environmental folks start to get a little bit of the cast off. So I'm very accustomed to building instruments out of used parts and kind of making work happen on a shoestring. So I was, I think, well suited in that way to work with Sasha.
So let's talk about, well, the lab and what you guys did in the lab for a minute. But Sasha had already synthesized many compounds. And then when you came along, you guys synthesized even newer compounds, right?
Yes, that's right. So he had the last compound that Sasha had prepared solo was a tryptamine called 5-methoxydiallyltryptamine. And there's kind of a funny story around that. He synthesized it in around 2004 with the idea of, including it in a next book after PCAL and TCAL, and it written up kind of a style description of its synthesis and some effects. An active compound, orally active, fast onset, relatively short duration, maybe an hour and a half or so, very fast acting. So taken on an empty stomach, you can start to feel effects in 10 to 12 minutes. So he was very impressed with that. But the psychoactive effects, psychiatric effects were modest at best. Active, I mean, you can start to feel that compound in the 10 to maybe 15 or 20 milligram range, but it never really breaks through to a sort of satisfying psychedelic state. It also is not really an entactogen. It's not similar to the methylene dioxy class of compounds. So it's sort of, neither fish nor fowl. Anyway, Sasha had the idea that, well, maybe if we modify the side chain, we can kind of tilt it a little bit more towards a more complete psychedelic effect. So we started to work on asymmetric allyltryptamines. And it turns out now, many years later, we've actually made quite a number of those with some improved chemistry. And a couple of them are definitely more psychedelically active. We've got a patent application out on this group of compounds. They preserve the kind of the temporal dynamics, being fast on, fast off, if you will. At least one of them we've taken through animal toxicology and have it pretty much ready to go into clinical trials. That's a compound that we call ASR 3001. Psychedelic internally, so the term of art is interoceptive. So you feel like you are on something akin to psilocybin, but there are no visual effects basically at all, similar to what you would experience on MDMA, which is not a visual compound. So we're interested in pursuing that because we think there's a middle ground here of subjects that might be benefited by having an introduction to psychedelics for anxiety or depression or whatever, but are anxious about having a fully immersive psychedelic state like psilocybin delivered to them. So we'll see how that goes. So we worked on those compounds for the first few months that I was here. Then around December of 2007, Sasha approached me with kind of a writing project. He said, Tanya and I have been working on this reference book, and we've kind of reached an impasse. We're not making any forward progress on it. Would you consider working with us on this? Well, that ended up becoming the Shulgin Index, which is, I think we're still pretty proud of it. It basically is a
It is
hybrid.
a great reference. Everybody
Yeah,
should have it.
yeah, it's a hybrid. It was kind of inspired by the Merck Index and sort of by, sort of annual review of pharmacology kind of treatment. So it's got 126 type compounds that each get a short chapter. And in each of those, there's a drawing of its structure, names by which it's known, chemical abstracts, identifiers for it, different salt forms, their melting points, synthesis methods, what's known of their biochemistry, pharmacology, legal status. And for each of those compounds, if there were structurally related compounds that maybe had not been researched as extensively as the type compounds for each of those chapters, they'd get treated in homolog and analog tables. So things that are similar but less known. And so altogether, there are about 2,000 compounds that are presented with extensive kind of cross-referencing tables. So that if you know, say, an empirical formula, you can go to one of those tables and go back to all the compounds that share that empirical formula. If you know a chemical abstracts number that's been spat out from, some mass spec searching program or whatever, you can go to a table of chem abstracts numbers and they'll divert you back into the body text. Got close to 200 mass specs that had never been published before. So that came out in 2011. Then kind of at that point, Sasha's health began to kind of decline. So although chemistry work continued, and any day that I was there and Sasha was able to make it out to the lab, which was most of the time, even when his health was not great, we would spend time working together. At that point, he wasn't really actively doing chemistry, but we were buddies. We were keeping each other company.
Yeah.
So
And did he have a goal of this is the ideal psychedelic compound, or was it just a constant state of experimentation and seeing how different things would work?
yeah, well, the model that I'd like to promote is that Sasha was an explorer. So explorers were followed by pioneers, and then by settlers, and then by city builders. So we're sort of at the settlers becoming city builders kind of state in the psychedelic arena. But Sasha was definitely out there at the bleeding edge of exploration. So his work was always hypothesis driven. If you look through his early notebooks, like the first probably dozen compounds that he made were all based off of the mescaline trimethoxyamphetamine discoveries. So mescaline, of course, was his first psychedelic experience. Turns out Ann's first psychedelic experience via peyote, even though they were not together when each of them had those experiences. The first semi-synthetic that shares similarity structurally to mescaline was what was called trimethoxyamphetamine, 3,4,5 trimethoxyamphetamine. So that was the first of a number of alpha alkyl mescaline homologs, if you will. Sasha had a marvelous experience with mescaline, with TMA, which had been previously synthesized in, I think, 1947. So Sasha prepared, of course, his own batch and sampled it and confirmed that it's about twice as potent, gram for gram as mescaline. But he observed that the subjective effects were very different. I think he's used terms like created hostile paranoia, and he described the difference between the two by saying on mescaline he could contemplate a rose for hours and be fascinated with its form and color and beauty, but on TMA you would want to take it apart. So just qualitatively very different.
Hmm.
And of course, at that time, so this would have been very early 1960s, the prevailing kind of psychological dogma was that the three known psychedelics, mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin, all produced the same effect, but only differed in potency and duration. Well, so with that first experience with TMA, Sasha blew a big hole in that. Said, this is absolutely not the case. These things all produce different states, and so that kind of set him on the path. So it
Yeah.
turns out the first couple of months of his notebooks from Dow Chemical, where he was doing that work, were these alpha chain homologs of mescaline, and I think he made let's see, the ethyl, the propyl, the butyl. I think he made it out to like 9 or 10 carbons. Well, they're all inactive. So once you get past an alpha methyl, there's kind of nothing really there, at least with that ring substitution pattern. So he kind of turned back, and there were two parallel tracks of his work at that point. He was working with methylene dioxymethoxy compounds that were derived from essential oils isolated from nutmeg.
Mhm.
So nutmeg is a plant that produces a psychoactive effect if you can wolf down enough of it. Uh,
Yeah, that's that compound myristicin.
that's right. That's right. Which is a methoxymethylene dioxy allylbenzene. And so there was a hypothesis at the time that it was known that prisoners would consume nutmeg as a drug substitute, and the idea was, well, maybe in the body these allylbenzene compounds are converted to something drug-like, and so the most likely candidate were an ammonia basically could be added across the double bonds of the side chain and create an amphetamine-like compound. So Sasha happily made a bunch of those. Found a couple that were interesting. They would be the MMDA series. Not very well known. I think because of the difficulty in acquiring starting materials, they never really were produced in any kind of quantity and dispersed out into the gray market. But then also he started to work on dimethoxy and polymethoxy substituted amphetamines, which led to eventually the discovery, well, first the discovery of TMA2. So that's again a trimethoxy substituted amphetamine.
Is that the
As
2,4,5
that's that,
TMA?
that's right. And so the 245 actually was kind of a major discovery. It turns out that for both the amphetamine series, which have a side chain with 3 carbons, and the phenethylamine series, which have a 2 carbon side chain, if you have a ring substitution pattern with a 2,5 dimethoxy and something in the 4 position, you've all but you're all but guaranteed to have a psychoactive compound and likely a psychedelic. So the first one that he discovered with that pattern was TMA2, which is 2,4,5, as you say, trimethoxyamphetamine. And that again was about 10 times more potent than TMA. In fact, if you read PCAL, the dosage range that's suggested is 12 to 24 milligrams. Well, so apparently the story was that Sasha, of course, would assess the activity of any of these new creations by careful self-administration. So in that era, there was no stigma against this. This was the sort of ethical home ground for medicinal chemists who are working on psychoactive drugs. If you wanted to give your new creation to subjects, to patients, you darn well better have experienced it yourself so that you know what you were producing in terms of an altered state in some other individual. So, plus at that time there were no good animal models that were readily available to screen for psychedelic activity. You could tell a stimulant, the rats will run around the cage a lot faster. But
Yeah, but it's hard to tell the psychedelic effect with animals.
that's right. Well, later
Yeah.
there were methods that came up, and actually one that's become quite prevalent now is a mouse model where a mouse injected with a psychedelic will have kind of a wet dog head shake response that's dose dependent, and it's highly correlated with substances that are known to be psychedelic in humans and doesn't require training of the mouse. Now, it turns out that the first report of that phenomenon was from 1962, But for whatever set of reasons, it was never really exploited as a screening mechanism for discovery of new psychedelics until much, much later.
Well, was it because at that time it was acceptable to try something yourself? I mean, it sounds like it's so fascinating to me that what is considered ethical then and now is so different and doesn't need to be that different. I mean, I know there's all these conversations now, oh, if you're a researcher, you shouldn't, let's say, take any of these compounds, but that was not the
Right,
case back
right,
then.
right. Well, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. So, many of the drugs that were developed in the first, you know, two-thirds of the 20th century, went through the bodies of their inventors before they went on to any kind of what we would now call clinical trial. And as you point out, it was considered the ethical route for, you know, assessing utility of the compounds and possible hazards. So it turns out that even the scientific journals were happy to publish reports of human psychoactivity, and Sasha even attempted to kind of quantitate the effects. He had two goes at that. Early on, he tried to promote the idea of mescaline equivalence. So if a compound was only as potent as mescaline, which although it's a lovely compound, it's not very strong. It takes 300 milligrams or more of a hydrochloride salt to produce the full effects. So if something was only as potent as mescaline, it would have a mescaline equivalent of one. If something was twice as potent, it would be a two, et cetera. So it was a way of ranking just raw potency. Never really caught on, although Sasha did publish a few papers that used that scale. Later, he came up with a more, you know, perhaps coarse but still useful approach that basically said it was like a series of pluses. So plus minus is like, are you feeling any effects at all of a substance? Are you feeling any alteration of anything? Maybe, maybe not. And then it goes plus, 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 and
Yeah,
then
and that's
four.
in Pikal and Tikal.
Right, right. And actually also published in an article about self-administration of psychedelics for discovery that Sasha, Ann, and their colleague Peyton Jacob published in the late 80s. So in any event, that became quite practical. And, the sort of full description is that, a single plus, you can definitely feel that you're being slightly altered by a chemical, but the effects are mild enough that you can continue doing your normal daily activities. You could probably drive. Two pluses, you're more now fully involved. Not advisable to drive. You can still be conversational, but do not operate heavy machinery or ride an animal when you're under the influence at that level. Three pluses, you're now fully engaged. You're probably going to have difficulty forming verbal contact with your compatriots. You certainly could not suppress the effects with any kind of ease to, rise to an emergency, etc. So you are definitely deeply involved. And then four pluses, he kind of sets aside as a state that is rarely achieved and not necessarily achieved by just increasing dose, but by whatever combination of factors, substance, your personal set, and what in your life you bring to the experience. The four plus state is one of transcendent wonderment, for want of a better term, where you may feel deep religious sensations, a feeling of oneness with the universe, but again, not something that's repeatable or achievable with any kind of plan or regularity. So it's one of those once in a lifetime or a few times in a lifetime kinds of states. So it kind of brackets the range of subjective response to do psychedelics. So anyway, he had promoted that starting in the mid 1980s. And around that time, we were in the second phase of the war on drugs. The scientific journals were starting to reject papers that included human effects. And also at about that same time, there were behavioral assays with animals, particularly one that David Nichols and his group at Purdue exploited quite a bit, dual lever drug discrimination tests. So in that scenario, you train an animal that if you give it a drug and it presses the corrective one of two levers, it'll get a food treat. So it's the Skinner box kind of operant conditioning approach, but where the cue is a drug state. So you basically would train an animal to respond positively if you train on, say, LSD, or conversely, say, methamphetamine. And then you continue to run these exposures, sometimes over a period of days, but more often a period of weeks, until the response is very well established in the animal. And then you give it a test drug. Does the animal respond as if you gave it the training drug, or does it give some intermediate response, or does it give no response? So that was actually one of the kinds of studies that was used by Nichols and Shulgin when they published their first couple of articles on MDMA. And so they had animals that were trained with DOM, another one of Sasha's psychedelic amphetamines, versus amphetamine stimulant. And the animal response was, neither fish nor fowl. It was intermediate between those two drug types. And so that was one of the pieces of evidence that MDMA, in fact, was operating by a different set of mechanisms of action, and it was
Mhm.
recognized by the animal as being something different. So that technique, that experimental method, started to really, pay off in the mid 1980s, and that and the reluctance on the part of the journals to publish human effects kind of conspired to pretty much drop away any acceptance of personal experimentation.
Well, yeah, this whole 80s, 90s to the mid to about 2006, that whole time period, you couldn't do any type of human research. And so it was good that at least some research kept going. And it was these, animal studies, the structure function studies with receptors that just kept the field alive.
Sure. And all of the sort of technical underpinnings of doing receptor binding assays and all that kind of thing, really sort of fell out of the burgeoning biotech world and the Human Genome Project, and all of that started to really rev up in the mid 1980s. So all of those things kind of conspired together to make it difficult or impossible to report on human effects. So
Mhm.
Sasha was one of, well, apart from maybe a few scientists in Switzerland who were doing human studies with psychedelics, he was one of the only holdouts, experimenting with these things personally
Yeah.
and making some progress.
Yeah, and Sasha also, it wasn't just the lab side of things, the pure science side of things, but it was the whole other side, the whole therapy side. And I feel like Anne brought a lot of just like the soul and heart into the whole operation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, Anne remarked in later years that Sasha was kind of a prickly character when they got together. He's certainly very, very bright. She kept making remarks about his IQ being above 185, but he really suffered no fools, and he had a very sharp wit, and was kind of, at least in earlier years, sarcastic, almost unbearably so, I guess, at times. But Anne is a funny, warm, love ball. She was just a delightful person. You know, I met her when she was already the age of my parents, so she was surrogate mom to many, and loved that kind of role. And I think she was very interested in psychological therapy. Her husband, when she and Sasha met, John Perry, was in fact a Jungian psychiatrist, and so she had absorbed by osmosis and personal interest a lot of theory, and particularly by the early 1970s. So let's see, they got together in 79, say, and were married in 81. Sasha had kind of rediscovered MDMA in the mid 1970s and was experimenting with it with some frequency, but also giving it to other psychologists and psychiatrists to work into their practices. And she fell right into that. and basically developed a lay practice that was based on her Jungian background and performed many sessions, here at the farm, all kind of, in the underground. But she became the model of, how one does psychedelic therapy. And
Yes.
so, it was the both of them together that preserved this work and brought it forward to where we are now.
I think her model is then what is the model that is practiced today so often.
That's right.
I mean, it's really amazing. It's like real people behind these major things. I mean, you read about these things in textbooks, but here it is, it's real life, real humans.
Yeah, and I guess I was just by luck, close enough geographically that I could come and visit and eventually, start to work with Sasha. And the love that they poured into their work, and what I continue to refer to as their radical welcoming of kind of all comers at here at the farm, as well as out there at meetings and various events. They were just inspiring. They really opened their hearts in the way that we all hope that the psychedelics would.
Yes. And now, like there's a couple different entities, but one is the Shulgin farm itself, the physical location, which is where the lab is, and how that's really becoming a community gathering spot, just like it always was when they were alive. And then there's the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute, which you lead. Can you tell us about those two entities?
Sure. To kind of put it into time context, so when Sasha passed in 2014, I sat down with Ann and Wendy and the rest of the family that were close by and talked about what's the future. And they were encouraging of the idea of carrying on the work, but at that point there was no, that was 2014, so we were just a little bit in front of the radical shift in acceptance of psychedelics as valuable agents that we're experiencing now. And so, I kind of knocked around in the cannabis industry for a couple of years, but it was really not until 2020 that another colleague of mine, Nick Cozy from University of Wisconsin, and I had published a paper on high quality DMT for therapeutic and experimental use. And we started getting inquiries from folks with the idea of investing in developing some kind of company around this work. So we formed with Nick and I and Ann together, incorporated the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute on Bicycle Day in 2021. The idea was to basically create a platform where we could develop as needed kind of modern laboratory facilities and acquire funding to continue to discover new molecules and new types of activity. And that's gone on fairly well. We got a fair amount of initial funding, which of course we did burn through. We got a couple of lab sites up and running, but right now we've kind of downsized back to just operating here at the farm. But we have on the order of 15 patent applications out that cover, you know, at least several hundred, probably in the low thousands of potential new structures. And we continue to make those and experiment with them as we're able. Now, a little later, 2023, Wendy and a couple of other now board members created the Shulgin Farm LLC, a nonprofit, with the goal of acquiring sufficient funds to purchase and preserve the property here, purchase it from Ann's family, who are the inheritors, and to make the necessary changes to turn it into kind of an ongoing community center, a place where people can meet and discuss psychedelics and really any other related topic. And it got off to kind of a slow start, but then by this year, it's really starting to take life. There's a barn building that Sasha's son Ted built in the early 2000s that has been undergoing gradual renovation. So we've hosted groups as large as 75 people for lectures, workshops, writing workshops, parties, and any proceeds from renting the place to groups like that goes to the effort to garner the funds to make the property purchase. So that's going well. We're still looking for further investment to round out the purchase plan, but that's well underway. I should say so. I'm the president of the ASRI. We sprang from the same loins, but I don't have a direct role in the now what's being called the Shulgin Foundation. So we work together. I've been helping putting on workshops for the foundation, but we're separate organizations, sort of administratively.
Well, I think it's great to keep it going in all these multiple different facets, keep the science progressing as well as the physical space, because that is actually a part of our culture at this point. It's like a cultural heritage site.
That's right. I was at a kind of a party celebrating historical site presentation of a plaque at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, home of the first atom smashers, and kind of the dawn of big science, that was being granted by the American Chemical Society. So I walked up to the president, who was giving this plaque, and said, there's another laboratory in the vicinity that probably is not on your radar, but you might want to think about it in the future. Because yeah, this kind of humble spot on the hillside here in Lafayette has really affected, I think, arguably hundreds of millions of people's lives. And we would love to see it preserved and enhanced, but not modified so much that the sort of down home funkiness changes.
Yeah, you
And
gotta
there's
keep
plenty
the
of that.
soul of the place. There's a lot of that.
Absolutely.
Now, Paul, since this is human school, I have to ask you, what is a lesson you've recently learned or are learning right now?
Well, that running a business is hard, and I'm not very good at it, but I keep trying to learn as fast as I can. Also, I'm learning that it really helps and is very kind of buoying, uplifting to connect with other scientists in the region here. And even though I'm I come from way in left field when compared to a lot of neuroscientists who are moving into the psychedelics arena, I feel like the contribution that I can make, being kind of a generalist scientist with a lot of hands-on experience on the chemistry side, is appreciated, and that's very kind of heartwarming to me.
I think also in everything, people get stuck in their own silos sometimes. And, you're someone that has experience in so many different facets that you're not really stuck in a silo. And I think that helps other people to also think differently about what they're doing.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I would hope that's the case.
Where do you see psychedelics going in the future?
Well, of course, right now we're sort of on a medicalized track, and I think the appreciation that there's a deliverability problem. The model of one therapist, one subject, one experience is a tough one to roll out. For the number of people that could probably benefit. Getting insurance companies to pay for long sessions is, of course, driving a lot of chemists to look for psychedelics that are maybe shorter acting. And, we would be among those. However, I think there's still, an active controversy about whether, in fact, the journey, the sort of otherworldly experience of long psychedelic exposure sessions is where the value really lies. So anyway, I'm, on the one hand, we are working on shorter acting compounds that may still be satisfyingly psychedelic, trying to address the need to increase throughput for, one therapist, one subject, one session kind of model. But also, I personally think that the exclusively medicalized model will eventually have to break down. It's true that psychedelics created some problems back in the 60s, but this was something new that, we here in the West were not very well prepared to absorb. And, the natural mind, in fact, is, a great reference to address, how different cultures approach psychoactives, cultures that have incorporated these things for hundreds or thousands of years into kind of normal life, have figured out how to segregate them in terms of who has access or expose people as a rite of passage, certainly that's the case with peyote and the huichols, with some of the drug substances in Africa and the Near East. So, I refer people to Aldous Huxley's Island as a model for how people can be introduced to psychedelics in a supportive way, with some education and some positive initial experiences. And then they can choose, whether it's something to visit again or if it's something to take value from a single experience and then move on with their lives. Certainly, on an epidemiological kind of level, it seems like psychedelics don't offer a lot of risk for abuse. If you consider abuse the repeated kind of pathological return to those states to where you have difficulty maintaining normal social relationships and a job and more normal life, doesn't seem to accompany psychedelics use. So, I kind of half kiddingly suggest, maybe what we need to have is like a driver's license model where, you take your driver education and then there's a little bit of behind the wheel training and then you get your permit. And then if you can pass the test, you can get your license. So, clearly young kids probably shouldn't be introduced to psychedelics too early. I think there's, adequate justification for that. But, a little education can go a long way. And what we've had in the past with the DARE program and gosh, some of the stuff that they put in front of us when I was in high school, just ghastly, ridiculous. All that did was to basically create a lot of distrust of authority, distrust of the legal system, and rejection of the just say no mentality. I think eventually, psychedelics seem to cross ideological lines. I mean, the January 6th shaman in Washington, D.C. apparently is a guy who likes psilocybin mushrooms. So, clearly political demarcations don't, in the same way as they did back in the 60s, kind of also outline who's going to be interested in psychedelics. So it's going to be a long road to that, but I think we can dig our way out. But, it's through better communication and education.
I mean, I couldn't agree more, and especially with the community education piece. I agree. I think that we need to just get better information out there because they're not going anywhere. And I don't think a purely medicalized model is it. I mean, we have to respect the indigenous cultures and their traditions and also, other forms of use. So yeah, and maybe this is like one of those pieces of that public education. We're getting information out there and hopefully, we'll keep doing that.
Yeah. And, quite frankly, I think society, Western society is on the brink of going through some enormous changes. AI is going to, wipe out a lot of jobs. It's going to give a lot of people a lot of spare time. That may be a good thing, may be a bad thing, but there could also be, I think, a valuable exploration of psychedelics as a way to find out, who we are and what we're going to make of all of this and how we're going to move forward. So
absolutely.
That's my idea and I'm sticking with it.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Paul.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Please like, subscribe, share, and download the podcast. And again, you can find us at Human School Podcast on Instagram. I'd like to thank Dr. Zac Efron for the theme music. And I'd just like to make a general disclaimer that any of the institutions I work for, including Community Regional Medical Center, UCSF Fresno, and American Ambulance, have nothing to do with any of my thoughts or opinions. And so we'll kindly leave them out of this. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.